The besieged city of Pokrovsk still stands. You wouldn't know that if you've listened to Russian President Vladimir Putin's most recent claims. However, for now, Pokrovsk is still a war zone, and the claimed full Russian control is anything but. Putin wants to use Pokrovsk for propaganda purposes. But the reality that he's trying to hide from the rest of the world is that the battle for Pokrovsk has been a bloodbath for Russia. Forces may eventually take the city. Even if they do, Ukraine has broken Russia at Pokrovsk by inflicting catastrophic losses on Putin's forces. First, let's provide a little bit of context. Before the Ukraine invasion, Pokrovsk was a fairly significant, though not hugely important, city in the Donetsk region. Home to about 60,000 people, the city was best known for its coal industry, though that all changed once Russia's forces rolled into Ukraine. As the battle for Donetsk intensified, Pokrovsk transformed from being just another city into a key logistical hub for Ukraine. Putin wants that hub, wants it so badly that he has committed troops to assaults in the Pokrovsk direction for 18 months, even as the city's military significance is stripped away. For Russia, Pokrovsk now represents a potential springboard for future assaults on the fortified cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. To Ukraine, this once important logistical hub has now become a kill zone through which it is extracting a massive price in Russian blood before it eventually falls. The sheer number of troops that Putin has dedicated to taking the city highlights how important its capture is to Putin. During the vaunted, ultimately failed summer offensive that Russia launched throughout Ukraine in 2025, Pokrovsk was Putin's main focus. Post reports that Russia dedicated around 100,000 soldiers from a force of about 700,000 to this small city alone. The number has only risen since, with the Moscow Times quoting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as claiming that Russia has now concentrated about 170,000 of its soldiers in the Pokrovsk direction. Whatever the true number may be, it's clear that Putin believes that overwhelming Pokrovsk's defenders through sheer numbers is the best tactic. And it's working, though it hasn't worked yet. Not that you'd know that if you listen to Putin. On December 2, on the eve of a potentially historic meeting with U.S. envoys, Putin claimed that Pokrovsk had fallen. Decked out in camouflage, displayed himself as every inch the military man as he declared the fall of the Ukrainian city, which just so happened to be perfectly timed to give himself leverage in the upcoming peace talks. Pokrovsk would become a good foothold for accomplishing all the objectives set at the start of the invasion. The Russian army can conveniently advance in all directions, the Moscow Times reports. We'll come back to that little coincidence later in the video. As for Putin, he backed his claims with evidence. December article covering the situation in Pokrovsk. The Telegraph reported that Russia's defense ministry has released footage that seems to back Putin's bold claim. Shared by the Associated Press on its YouTube channel, the footage seems undeniable. Standing clear as day in the center of Pokrovsk are Russian troops waving their country's flag. The video is only a few seconds long, appears concrete enough that Russia shared the video on state television and has used it as evidence for its claim that Pokrovsk has fallen. If true, provides Putin with some much-needed leverage ahead of peace talks with the U.S., only not all is as it seems. Hours of the Russian footage being aired, Ukraine disputed its accuracy. The country didn't try to claim that Russia's soldiers hadn't reached the center of Pokrovsk. It claimed that the Russian flag hadn't been waved and planted. However, as has often been the case with Russia's flag-based escapades, the soldiers who planted the flag didn't remain where they were for long. They were beaten back not long after shooting their video. Telegraph reports Ukraine as claiming. That report is backed by the Ukrainian military's Eastern Command, which says search and assault operations and the elimination of the enemy in urban areas continue in Pokrovsk. None of that would be happening if Russia controlled Pokrovsk. It appears that Putin is telling lies. At best, the situation is confusing. However, Russia has laid plenty of precedents to show that it is willing to use false aims of victory for propaganda. At around the same time as Putin was claiming that Russia now controlled Pokrovsk, Kremlin also said that Vovchansk had fallen to Russia's forces. That's according to a December 2 report by the Kiev Independent, which says that Ukraine has denied the very timely claims of Vovchansk's fall, just as it has denied that Russia has full control over Pokrovsk. Ukraine's general staff even took to Telegram to explain what the world is seeing in Russia's flag-waving footage, stating, "This is merely yet another attempt by the Kremlin to use a staged flag-planting video for propaganda purposes in order to influence participants in international negotiations." It's also likely no coincidence that December 2 also saw RBC Ukraine report on Putin's that Russian forces are on the verge of taking the city of Kupiansk. According to the outlet, Russia's president claimed that his forces managed to block up to 15 Ukrainian battalions in the city, suggesting that Russia is gaining increasing control. Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of Russia's general staff, went a step further, claiming that the city had been liberated from Ukraine's control. Neither claim is true, RBC Ukraine says. In fact, the vast majority of Kupiansk remains in Ukraine's hands, the point that Zelensky himself says that almost all of Russia's troops have been cleared from the city. Far from being yet another supposed site of Ukrainian loss, the Kupiansk axis is the one on which Ukraine's defenders are achieving their greatest successes. While Russia's lies about Pokrovsk and Vovchansk are egregious, the claims about Kupiansk are outright fabrications, RBC Ukraine says, show just how far Putin and the Kremlin are willing to go to create a version of the Ukraine invasion that favors Russia. Half-truths, misrepresentations, and outright lies are Putin's stock in trade. But reality tells a very different story. As Russia's soldiers continue a glacially slow advance through Pokrovsk, it's not that the city is going to survive Russia's attacks. The odds are high that it will eventually fall. But that fall hasn't happened yet, and if and when it does, we'll be able to look at one part of the battle for Pokrovsk as an outright victory. It will have lost the city. But the price Putin paid in the blood of his own soldiers will be so high that they may well break Russia's future attempts to take more territory in Donetsk. How high Russia's losses have been is a matter for debate, though even the lowest numbers suggested would be catastrophic for Putin. The Moscow Times provides some of the more conservative estimates in its December 2 report, with the caveat that it is impossible to reliably assess the losses on either side of the fight for Pokrovsk. Outlet quotes the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, says that Russian forces have incurred significant casualties in their months-long campaign to seize Pokrovsk. Zelensky has also shared a figure, claiming that Russia lost at least 25,000 soldiers in the Pokrovsk direction in October alone. These numbers aren't estimates, Ukraine's president claims. That every single one of Russia's 25,000 losses in Pokrovsk during October has been confirmed because they were all recorded by the first-person view, or FPV drones that Ukraine's military used to cause the losses. If anything, the number is even higher than 25,000. With Zelensky suggesting that Russia may have lost between 2,000 and 3,000 more of its troops to weapons that are incapable of recording evidence, such as artillery. Remember, these numbers only cover October, and they appear to have declined markedly in November. If the ISW is accurate, it says that Ukraine's military has claimed that it killed 221 Russian soldiers and wounded a further 545 in the battle for Pokrovsk in November. Of those casualties, 519 of the deaths and 131 of the injuries occurred inside Pokrovsk itself. This tells us that Russia's forces are indeed inside Pokrovsk, though they have yet to take the city. It also suggests that Ukraine is now focusing a substantial amount of its resources on taking out those who enter the city rather than dealing with the dwindling masses that have attempted to encircle Pokrovsk. As we said earlier, it's likely that Pokrovsk will eventually fall. Before it does, Ukraine is going to extract many pounds of flesh from the Russian army. If we look at Putin's entire push for Pokrovsk, the numbers get even worse. October may have been the single most painful month that Russia experienced in its fight for the embattled city. 18-month siege of Pokrovsk and the surrounding region shows that the 25,000 lost in October is just a drop in the ocean. G to the commander of Ukraine's 429th Separate Achilles Battalion, Yuri Fedorenko, Russia's total Pokrovsk losses have exceeded 100,000. According to David Axe, who is a former Forbes military correspondent and now the author of the Trench Art column, it may be even worse than that for Russia. Axe shares the same 100,000 figure as Fedorenko, only he claims that Russia has experienced those casualties between January and the beginning of October 2025. Axe's claim came before Zelensky revealed the 25,000 deaths Russia experienced in the Pokrovsk region in October. They also don't cover the many months before the start of 2025 in which Russia pushed toward the city, losing thousands of soldiers along the way. What seems clear at this point is that at least 100,000 Russian soldiers have become casualties of Putin's push for Pokrovsk. The number may be much higher than that, though. As the Moscow Times points out, every number shared is an estimate, rather than a statement of pure fact. However, it would seem that Ukraine is likely not too far off the mark with its estimate if a Euromaidan press report on the Pokrovsk situation is anything to go by. That report says that Ukraine's 155th Separate Mechanized Brigade has claimed that Russia's Pokrovsk losses so significant that there are some areas of the region where you can find up to 20 dead Russian soldiers lying within 10 square meter areas. For context, Health Central says that the average body surface area of an adult man is 1.9 square meters. That means you'd need around 5 men to cover a 10 square meter area. If there are 20 soldiers in this type of space, that can only mean that Russia is losing soldiers at such a rate that their bodies are literally stacking on top of one another. There are two horrifying thoughts that occur. Either Russia's soldiers are attacking in extremely concentrated clusters, them easy targets for Ukraine's artillery and drones, or they're attacking in small groups, with each group following the other into Ukrainian death traps. Each group that follows would have to climb over the bodies of those who came before as Ukraine's drones hunt them down, which is as terrifying an example of the meat grinder tactics that Putin has deployed in the Ukraine war as any that we have seen thus far. By now, it's clear that Russia's losses in Pokrovsk are massive. But what about Ukraine's? Surely the city's defenders have been forced to ensure death on a massive scale to inflict such catastrophic casualties on the invading Russian forces. Has indeed suffered losses in Pokrovsk, though they're nowhere near as heavy as one might assume. Itself doesn't share its casualty numbers. Ironically, the one number that the Moscow Times is able to report comes from a Russian telegram channel named SA. Channel claims that Ukraine has lost around 500 soldiers in the battle for Pokrovsk. This is a Russian channel. Agenda to make Russia look as good as possible, and even SHOT can only claim that Ukraine has lost around 500 soldiers. The context of Russia's losses, Ukraine's casualty rate is minuscule. The math highlights that, assuming the 100,000 Russian casualties mentioned earlier is accurate, and that number is on the conservative side, that Russia has lost a little over 15 soldiers for every Ukrainian loss in the battle over Pokrovsk. Of course, invading forces typically expect to lose more soldiers than fortified defending forces, but even then, casualty rate that is at least 15 times higher than Ukraine's isn't good for Russia. It shows us that Putin is bleeding troops. It paints a very different picture of the situation in Pokrovsk than the one that Putin wants to paint. That brings us nicely back to something. we mentioned earlier in the video, which is the coincidental timing of Putin's announcement of the supposed capture of Pokrovsk. By now, it's clear that the city hasn't fallen, which means that Ukraine continues to inflict casualties on Russia to add to the massive pile it has already created. However, wants the world to believe that Pokrovsk has fallen because he is meeting with U.S. envoys, including Steve Witkoff and U.S. President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner on December 2. That meeting will have concluded by the time you watch this video. Still, several outlets and people have suggested that Putin is exaggerating the scale of Russia's Pokrovsk victory, in addition to purposefully obscuring Russia's losses to give the impression that Russia is doing better than it really is ahead of this meeting. Isadu certainly makes that claim, stating, Kremlin has repeatedly made exaggerated claims about the battlefield as part of its ongoing cognitive warfare effort to falsely portray a Russian victory as inevitable, such that Ukraine and the West should concede to Russia's demands now. The Moscow Times says that former Ukrainian SBU officer and military expert Ivan Stupak echoes these thoughts. Stupak says that Putin's declaration about the fall of Pokrovsk is about creating an image that is in control, that he has the situation firmly in hand to send a message to the American side that everything is going well while everything is going badly for Ukraine. Putin's claims simply don't reflect reality. The Telegraph says that Deep State is an open-source intelligence organization that reports on the situation in Ukraine, claims that several regions of Pokrovsk were still heavily contested as of December 2. That alone means that Russia hasn't claimed the victory that Putin claims. The head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, Andriy Kovalenko, also says that Putin's announcement was geared exclusively for Western audiences and to raise the stakes in diplomacy. It's all about creating the impression of strength. We'll be hoping that impression is strong enough for him to convince the U.S. that Ukraine would have to make further concessions to Russia, and including the ceding of territory if peace is to be declared. The Russian media is saying the same thing, the Telegraph reports. Says that Russia's Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, which is a Moscow-based daily, reports that the supposed advances are a hint that more and more Ukrainian territories are under our control. Next time, Russia's conditions may be tougher. Even the camouflage that Putin wore while making his announcement was part of a choreographed routine designed to display military strength to the U.S., claimed on December 2. The outlet points out that Putin hasn't budged from his maximalist demands, which include Ukraine conceding much of the Donbas region, of which Pokrovsk is a part. Theatrical announcement was designed to portray Putin as a powerful leader who is guiding the unstoppable Russian forces to an inevitable victory. Pokrovsk, Vovchansk, and Kupiansk have already fallen, Putin is claiming, and the rest of Ukraine won't be far behind. The reality is much different. Doesn't need reality to match his version of events. What he needs is for the delegates that the U.S. sending into Moscow to believe what he says. If Witkoff and Kushner fall for Putin's lies, they will communicate the faked Russian position to the rest of the Trump administration, leading to the U.S. even more pressure on Ukraine to concede more than it should as part of a peace settlement. If it all works out, the 100,000 plus soldiers that Putin has ordered to their deaths in Pokrovsk will be worth it. Putin will get what he wants. Question now is also the simplest one: will Putin's ploy work? Russia's president has certainly gone into propaganda overdrive on the eve of his meeting with the U.S. delegation. Beyond the false claims of victories in key cities, has also attacked Ukraine's European allies by claiming that they're purposefully sabotaging America's efforts to bring peace to Ukraine. They don't have a peace agenda, they're on the side of the war. PBS reports Putin as saying during an investment forum held before he meets the U.S. envoys. Europe's goal is blocking the entire peace process. Putin raged before claiming that Russia will be ready for a fight. These comments aren't really meant to be yet another threat against Europe. Rather, Putin is trying to communicate another message to the US. America worked so hard on its peace agreement. Putin is saying as he drips honey into the collective American ear. Are you really going to let these warmongering Europeans stop us from convincing Ukraine that the deal on the table is the best deal the country is going to get? It's sly. Some would even say it's clever. But everything that Putin is doing is built on a foundation of lies, whether the US realizes that or not is what will determine the outcome of the discussions in Moscow that should have taken place by the time you watch this video. As for Pokrovsk, the situation isn't good for Ukraine. Putin may be lying about Pokrovsk having fallen, but as The Guardian reports, jam for the city is still likely coming. Ukraine's goal now will be to stretch that end game out, both to aid its own position in negotiations and to inflict even more losses on an exhausted Russian assault force. Pokrovsk will likely fall, but it hasn't yet, and Ukraine needs the US too. Know the scale of damage being done to Russia, the many thousands of casualties more that await Putin's forces in Donetsk, even after the fall of Pokrovsk. For now, lies through his teeth about Pokrovsk, Russia's forces are walking into hell elsewhere in Ukraine. Traps are being strung, and US volunteers are helping Ukraine to rack up even more casualties in the Lemon direction, which is yet more evidence that Russia is a long way from the inevitable victory that Putin claims. Find out more in our video. Remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in Pokrovsk and in the Ukraine war peace negotiations.